Good morning. Beis, volume 2. At the bottom of page Aleph Coupe 1180. 1180. Okay. So let me sum up what we've been learning. As I pointed out, Rabbi Rashab is now tying together and connecting the dots of literally close to over 180 pages. But more specifically, as I read yesterday, the last 40 pages where he discussed where he moved over from lechem min hashamayim, lechem min haaretz, the bread from earth and the bread from heaven, which went into the whole discussion of Daas Elyon and Daas Tachten. So we learned yesterday how that comes together, because those two types of experience, those two type of breads, if you wish, reflect Daas Tachten is the bread from earth, which is birur. In other words, removing the eichel from the pselis, or the pselis from the eichel, basically the birur of separating and elevating from the material world the divine nutrients and the divine energy. And Daas Elyon, lechem min hashamayim, that comes from above, that's beyond pselis, as we learned earlier, beyond waste. And that is hamshacha mamayla lamata. And that, he says, one is shiluv. The first one, Daas Tachten, is shiluv havaya ba'adnai. So it's discovering the divine within the elikus, within existence. And the other is shiluv adnai ba'avaya, the yuchad havaya lekim of shiluv adnai ba'avaya, adnai, as the divine is being encompassed in its source into higher levels. And earlier we learned in this page that it's really 3 stages. The first stage is Daas Tachten, like I just described. The second is like Re'usa Deliba, where you come to realize the divine that's beyond, that the Kelim of Atzilus come to recognize there's something higher. In Aveda, that's Re'usa Deliba, the Aveda Lamayla Mitam V'das, but it's still your recognition. That is relatively Daas Elyon. And then comes the true Daas Elyon, what he says is Etzem HaNeshama, the Etzem. And I should point out, which I didn't, that when you go back, you may remember this or maybe not. If you go back to this page here, page 1129. If you don't mind, turn there if you want to, if you have the book safer in front of you. If you want to follow this, excuse me. Excuse me. If you want to follow the text and you don't have it, you can go to ayinbeis.com and the PDFs are there. So on page 1129, just look at the beginning of the paragraph, a nimtza, new paragraph there. Sheyesh gimel madreges. Ha'echad b'chinas enig ha'murkev b'chachma bina. Ha'beis b'chinas enig atzmi, the b'chinas atik, rak shabah b'murgish. I'll explain what that means in a minute. V'ha'gimel is 5 lines down. Hu b'chinas enig atzmi mamash habilti murgish. Hu b'chinas primius atik. So you may recall that those were the 3 meals of Shabbos. And even man has also levels. And the highest level, of course, is this 3rd level. So though they're all levels of oinig, pleasure, but the first is murkav, means a composite. It's not pure pleasure, it's combined with other things. In Aveda, it means that your divine pleasure is connected with your personality, like the first level that we're speaking about. It's not pure divine pleasure. It's already connected with some form of structure. The second, he already calls it Einig Ha'atzmi, it's core, but it comes by Murgish, it means you still can experience it. And the third is beyond experience altogether. These 3 essentially are similar to the 3 we learned on this page, 1180. Because if you continue on, you'll see that he calls them 3 levels in Ratzeh, and he calls the level 1 Al Pitam V'das. Go to the next page, 1130. You'll see the first line he says, that I'm sorry. Earlier he says, Harotzeh Aleph, 6 lines from the bottom of 1129. It says the first rotzeh Aveda shal pitam v'das. Right? We learned that. Aveda pitam v'das. Shazo Avedis habirurim be'elam is biyah. You're working in the world of biyah. It's like the weekdays. And birur beginners birur pselis metech echel or echel metech pselis. And that's how you elevate biyah to go to Atzilus. He says that's the aliyah of the first stage of Shabbos. Because Shabbos comes right after the weekdays. It's the first aliyah. Then he says aliyah, the second aliyah. If you go to the next page, you'll see is l'mayla mitam v'das. And he actually says, Yeshlem is right here on the 6th line of the next page. That's the second level. Mam is the same words. Kelim of Atzilus, Ru'usa Deliba, Eichel Metech. And he goes on to explain it more. I'm not going to go through it all. You can look it up yourself. And then he comes Bitlav Akeli, he says Murgish and so on. Madrega Gimel. That goes down 3, 4, 8, around 12. 1 second. 3, 6, 9, 12. 14 lines from the top of page 1130. And the third level, Baratzeu Ba'ir. That's an Oir. Bu'inyan ha'ave b'tanugim yechida sheben neshama. Yechida. Like he said here in the page 1180, it's Yechida, the Aliyah Bitlin Atzmus Ein Sof, and that's beyond Birur altogether. It says a place that doesn't even reach, food doesn't even reach there. That's why it says Lo Yachlu on the third meal. Okay. And then he goes on to explain that these 3 stages, he says, and this Avedi, he says clearly, the Tchila goes like this. First, you begin with level 1, then level 2, and then level 3. Okay? So here you have how he's tying it all together. So that makes a lot more sense because when we read this page that we've learned, 1180, you see it was very big kitzur. Because the Rebbe Rashab obviously knew what he had written earlier and expected that us understanding that this is now flowing from there. So in addition to it, we spoke yesterday about Daas Elyon, Daas Tachten, the next Maimer, the Tzavim Maimer, that talks about the 2 types of lechem. One, the lechem, the bread from earth and the bread from heaven. And then Daas Elyon, Daas Tachten, now it all comes together here in these 3 levels that we discussed. And as yesterday we learned, the lechem in Hashemayim, lechem in ha'aretz, lechem in ha'aretz, Daas Tachten, and lechem in Hashemayim, Daas Elyon. I wanted to just say one more thing to repeat what I said at the end of yesterday's class. When I was asked, so what does it mean practically in our Aveda? Let me just sum that up as well. It's worthwhile refreshing that though this, obviously, that is Maimer, these Maimorim are for everybody, from the greatest Chassidim and Tzaddikim and Yerushalayim and Bali Aveda to the simplest person. So that's why it's critical that each one of us translates this into our terms. So yesterday I gave somewhat of a little framework, and I'll just repeat it briefly. It's worthwhile doing that. That we have to find in our own personal lives the b'chol avavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol meidecha. Even though that's not the words he's used here, but it has some parallels. Which means we all daven every day, and we all go through different stages of our own work. So though yes, we'd be satisfied if we don't surrender and give into one Yetzer Hara of ours, but still Chassidus expects more than that from us. Not just the minimum, the maximum. But obviously the maximum for you is not the maximum for me, and the maximum for me is not the maximum for somebody else. Every one of us is in a different place. So we have to identify in our lives these 3 stages, so to speak, these 3 step elements. So what I said briefly was like this. There's the first step in every Aveda is recognizing it's not all about you. You know, Aniva Afsi 8 is the natural inclination. I wake up in the morning, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I'm this, I'm that, I'm needy. If you don't have a Shulchan Aruch, if you don't have any discipline, no guidelines, people will just be self-indulgent. So the first step is taking the yesh, that yesh hanivra, and aligning it somewhat to the Ayin, to recognizing it's not all about you. There's a God. You were blessed with life. You were given gifts. First thing, just acknowledge it's not about you. I acknowledge before you, thank you for returning my soul to me. So write the first bittul. That's necessary in all of life. You've already somewhat sublimated and refined yourself. Obviously, it's a first step, but it's an important step. Because if you don't start with that, where are you going to go from there? You have to begin somewhere to redirect the yesh from looking at itself to looking outside of itself, to others, to heaven. So when you make a bracha, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam shehakol niyeh b'dvarei, you're doing the same thing. I'm going to drink some water or some other food, and I'm going to thank you, and I'm going to bless God. I'm going to draw God a little deeper. You're redeeming the spark in the shehakol niyeh b'dvarei. Remember dvarei, God's word. Everything came from your dvarei, from His word. Etc. Okay. The same thing, Birchas Hamazon. When you bench, you're saying Hazonas Hakel. You're acknowledging the divine blessing and the sparks within the food you've eaten. This is all on your terms. This is called Birurim. Same thing when you go to work. You don't just work, you give meiser from your tzedakah, you're kind, you're compassionate, you're always looking to do a favor for another. Basically, you're revealing the purpose of your existence in existence. Without this step, to jump to any other step would be what he called earlier delusional. Because if you're not doing this, what exactly are you doing? Someone will say, you know what, I'm so involved in Yichudei Law, I have no time for Yichudei Tata. In a sense, if I'm only involved in understanding Lifnei Tzimtzum, but are you a mensch at home or at work? Are you a sensitive person? Are you giving? Or you're a selfish person that just thinks about Yichudei Law? Now, obviously, it's a ridiculous statement because Yichudei Law would never let you be selfish. But the point is, we don't jump. We start from the first steps. Just like when we educate children. You don't suddenly learn the deepest things. You teach a child, you say thank you, you say I'm sorry, you thank Hashem, you thank each other, basic principles. Now we move to level 2. Level 2 is no longer just that likus on your terms. But now you're recognizing that the Eibishter is beyond you. So it's not just a matter of Elokim, you're recognizing now the Havaya Elokim, that there's a Havaya. And not just Havaya in the terms of Elokim, Havaya within Elokim, or Havaya within Adnai. But now you're recognizing that this Dvorei, Shehakol niyeh b'dvorei, that Dibur elevates into the source. The Dibur was not, the God is not defined by his speech. He expresses himself through his speech, and he relates to another through his speech. But now you're recognizing the Dibur, just like you hear a teacher speak, the teacher is not defined by his speech. His speech is defined by the teacher. So there's something more going on. And that leads us to the Usa Deliba of Lamayla Mitam Daas. It's not purely in the rational understanding that God is doing something for you, so therefore it makes sense to you to thank him. Or the godliness that relates to Tam V'das and relates to our understanding and feelings and so on. I should have mentioned, by the way, all this is not just his bananus, it's also his V'daita Ayim, Meshavesa Levavecha, and Avedas HaBerudim. It's Mechin, Midas, and action. So now we come to the second level, which he calls Das Elyon, because now you're talking about a perspective that God is the primary thing and existence is secondary. But it's still a bittul of the neshama, like he said, going up, and he wants to connect to its source. So it's not just you now want to acknowledge and connect to the spark that's giving you life. You want to connect to the divine where the neshama rooted from, which is like the flame going to its source, even though you will be consumed by it or absorbed by it. But this is all still an Aveda, and he calls it clearly, even Chai, even it's still based on Hasaga, but you're coming now to higher states of awareness. Then comes the etzem of who you are. So this second level would be where at times in the day, we have times where we're not focused particularly on what I want. You recognize that something is beyond you, something more transcendent. The third level, on the other hand, is pure etzem, like we talked about Yom Kippur. It's the etzem and neshama when it's sparked by something special happens. It could be Yom Kippur, it could be a special simcha, chasana, a special moment where the etzem suddenly gets revealed. And this is not about you've come to understand and appreciate the God within you or the God beyond you, but it's just the core connection of who you are with something completely beyond everything. And this is much more, as you said, libe yedeya. You just instinctively know it. It's not due to a contemplation. Because it's not something that's going to be born from something that you're working on. It's something that's there. It just needs to be awakened. It needs to be something that you become aware of. So it's not through your direct effort, even though your effort reveals it. And that's, of course, those rare experiences. But as I said yesterday, I wanted to just elaborate a bit more. We don't live in the world of etzem. Everything about life is not atzmis. Everything about life is giluyim. Structures, manifestations, presentation, projection. When you and I, when we're communicating, of course there's an etzem behind the scenes, but we're communicating. Communication by definition means we're experiencing something. An experience is not etzem. Oh, the only true etzem, of course, is atzmos, because it's the only self-contained reality that's mitziusim, atzmusim, and built in mitzius, nimtza, mechuyev, mitzius, and all the words we learned here in Ayin Beis and also in Tzadik Dalet, because it's the only thing that is absolutely necessary. Everything else goes into the world of Giluyim because it's something that God chose to put into play. So the interesting thing is you could have had a situation where God said, you know what? Etzem is off limits. You will never come to my etzem. You'll never touch my etzem. I will not allow you there. All you have is the playground I've created for you. It's called Giluyim. But they're great Giluyim. We're talking about the highest levels of Ein Sof and Simsum and Ak and Akudim, Nekudim, Vrudim, Atzilus. Is a lot going on. And it's very grandiose. It's not minimalistic. But Etzem is off limits. The same thing in a human being. You want a relationship with your spouse, with your children, with friends, it goes to a certain limit. Etzem can never touch Etzem. Hypothetically, God could have created the world that way. And Etzem remains reserved and alone in a way where you can't even experience it. It's something that you cannot define. Like I often point out, what does life feel like? Or what is your left leg doing right now? There are many things that you're experiencing that just atzmizdik there. They're not because they need to be experienced. They're just there. It's just there. So essentially, etzem is really defies experience, defines definition, defines awareness. And even when we get into a transcendent state, it's still an experience. It's an experience beyond the limited vision and perception of the structures of existence. In other words, even if you reach the infinite, it's still infinite. It's not finite, and it's beyond finite, but it's still infinite. It's still an experience one way or another. It can be an experience of awe. It could be an experience of grandeur and majesty, but it's an experience. Etzem is not an experience. That's why it says Etzem bilti mizgala, Etzem bilti mispashet. And yet, God in his infinite, or you could say mysterious desire, chose to bring Etzem into the picture. He wanted the Etzem. That's why we say, Nesava Kadosh Baruch Hu Liyislei Dir B'Tachtem. That's an Atzmusei Baruch. That's not in Giluyim. And that's why we call it a taiva, because we have no word for it. So we need a word that there's no question, there's no ways to ask a question why. There is no why. Etzem is etzem, and that's that. But we don't really feel comfortable there. Even when I say this, I say to you, we always want to say, well, there must be some reason. There must be something, some need. Why would he do it if he didn't do it? Why are we so insistent? Because we're so trained, we are so programmed. We're part of the structure of existence. Structure of existence doesn't relate to completely beyond structure for no reason, for no need. Excuse me. And yet, when you start thinking about it, you come to realize that the etzem inside you as well is also that way. Your etzem is not defined by anything. It's not defined by need. It is what it is. So the question then, of course, is can you bridge these two worlds? Can etzem be bridged with giluyim when they're so apart? So that's why on one hand you say atzmus is beyond everything. Even loize ikar elokus shenimtze memena oir. That's what it says. This is not the primary thing of God, of atzmus, that oir comes from him, even though oir is a total bittul dika, total selfless reflection of the source. But that also is not defined the source. That just defines oir, that oir has nothing else but the source. But the source has much more than oir does. It's like we say, Hu mekeme shalelim av ein elam mekeme. There's nothing, he is everything, God, but not everything is him. But on the other hand, atzmus, again, is not limited by anything, chose to say, I will reveal myself through oir to existence. I will create a yesh hanivra that actually reflects the yesh amiti, that ein le'ila v'siba, that feels like it's its own entity. So it should have a taste of me. Obviously, it's not me. God did not create another God, God forbid, but he created us with the tools to be able to experience both gilui and etzem. And gilui reveals etzem through its bittul. I don't want to go through that because we learned that at length and we discussed it at length. The point I want to make is that when you talk about these three levels, you come to level 3, he clearly says it's etzem. It's the etzem. It's not about hasaga. It's not about Daas even. It's tachlis hayidiyah shalei neda. But the interesting thing is you come to level 3 after level 1 and 2. You'll say, but 1 second, 1 and 2 are giluyim. Yeah, but that's how the Eibishter made it. For us to experience etzem, we need to go through giluyim. And then since there's an etzem within us, you can appreciate. It's like someone who learns all year. I remember thinking many times, when you saw the Rebbe in Yom Kippur or Simchas Torah, which is also like Gilui Etzem through dancing. It wasn't just dancing, it was someone who all year round did the Aveda on all the levels. In Asiya, Yetzirah, Bria, Atzilus, the weekdays, on Shabbos. So then when they come to Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Simchas, and Sukkot, and Simchas Torah, obviously it's a whole different experience. It's not just, oh, okay, we have now a new experience. The more you're saturated through the lower levels of Das Tachten and Das Elyon with Elikus, the more keli you are to receive the etzem. Now that doesn't mean, we know the story with the Kukuriku, Ish Pasha doesn't have all the Giluyim, also touches etzem. But as I explained, that's not, however, that's not what you're looking for. You're not looking to become illiterate. It's just saying that a person that doesn't have all the Giluyim, there's still an etzem there. The goal is to have the best of both worlds, to be a Talmud Chacham, to learn Torah, appreciate what God is all about, to have Ava v'yira emotions about it, permeate yourself. So then you come with all your being. And then when you experience etzem, it's a very different type of experience. Which brings me to why he says, Tachlis hayidiyah shalei neda. Remember, I asked the question, so Tachlis hayidiyah, it means the lower levels of Das we spoke about are recognition and feeling, hakara, hargoshe, iskashrus, ischabrus. Yes, you're connecting to godliness. Let's start with Das Tachten. You're connecting to it. You're not just understanding that there's a divine spark, there's an ayin in the Yesh HaNivra. You actually feel it's personal. You're personalizing it. You're identifying with it. That's what Das is. So that's a connection with Elikus. That's not a connection with some outside force, God forbid. However, it's Elikus as it comes with Tzimtzum. But remember, Havayahu Elikim. And both of them are coming from Atzmus. So it's not a small thing. It means you, the Yesh, has connected to Elikus. You don't feel yet, and you don't know the higher levels. But that piece that you have of the divine spark, even you hear the Kia, the Dvar Hashem, is still God's words. And from God's point of view, it's all part of the higher levels, all the way to Atzmus itself. However, you're experiencing it on your terms. But now you have what to hold on to. So you're basically holding on to a piece of Elikus, and that Elikus is going to lead you on a journey up the ladder, all the way through Seder Ishtalshlus, which is all obviously created by God, the divine structure. And remember, we learned that the divine structure is also divine. Even the Eir HaGvul of the Esser Spheris is just one of infinite possibilities. So it's still part of the divine infinite. And as you come to appreciate godliness and its greatness on your terms, then when you come to the levels where you realize God is beyond you, and then you realize that God is even beyond being beyond, and then you come to the understanding of so the idea, this idea, Das Tach, leading you to the first level of Das Elyon, leads you to a idea, an actual identification. You now know the unknowable. You know the etzem, but it's not through knowledge. In other words, not through the seichel of Yediyah, it's through the hakara of Yediyah, that like you sense it. That's why he said, Halev Yediyah. The heart just knows instinctively. So you could say, how does that compare to the das that comes in seichel? The das of seichel leads you to the das of instinct. But it's now not an instinct and intuition that precedes das. It came through all your understanding, everything that you related to, the godliness on your terms, the godliness beyond you. And then that leads you to a hakara. You actually come to recognize that this is the etzem that you're really, where you're originally rooted in, etzem touching etzem. So yes, a child a newborn knows its mother, but there's no giluyim there. That's just etzem and etzem. What we're talking here is an etzem and etzem that comes after you do have a recognition, and then you appreciate. So imagine, let's say, go back to that baby. A baby recognizes its mother, doesn't need any intelligence for that. There's some instinct. Etzem recognizes etzem. But now imagine that child grows up, and the child becomes a Rebbe, and then he meets his mother. Like the Rebbe met his mother. Tell me, is it the same as when he was a baby? When he was a newborn, it was just instinct. And now it was instinct plus all the giluyim and all the appreciation. So you have both ends of it. You have the etzem and the gili. Again, much more can be said on this, but I just wanted to make it tachas hayediyah shalei neda. So like we spoke when Moshe says to Hashem, show me your face. And Hashem says, you can't see my face and live. And then he says, I will show you my back, but my face you will not see. As we explained from the Panim Yafas, the Rebbe says, the Rebbe explains, as well as the Panim Yafas, that what? By not looking, you'll see me. He doesn't say, by not looking, you'll see me. Not by not looking, you won't see me. In other words, there's a way to see me directly. There's a way to see me by not looking. But you can only come to that if you first see what you could see. Then you come to realize, there's a level, and I can experience it, but I don't necessarily have to see it on my terms as with my physical eyes. In other words, it's not coming to fit into your structure. You have now refined yourself enough to you to absorb that higher reality. Okay.
Reminds
and
me
as the
of
pasuk says, that a person will no longer need to teach another, because kulam yedu esi atzmus. Everyone will know me, from young to old. So the Rebbe's father and the Rebbe ask, if it's K'tan v'agdelim, what means kulam yedu esi? Because everyone will experience the etzem in their way. In other words, it's not the same for one person or another, because each person comes with their structure. At the end of the day, there is a cotton, there's a gadol. And the more Talmud biyadei, the more you train yourself on your terms to relate to Alikus, in many ways, the more internalized will be the experience of the etzem itself. So in other words, the difference between, let's say, a Rebbe on Yom Kippur and a simple person Yeah, everybody gets the etzem, but a simple person doesn't get it in their terms. The simple person has it because he doesn't have any giluyim that get in the way. So therefore, he just goes straight, express straight to the source. The kukuriku of the child of the farm boy, he just cried kukuriku and he pierced the heavens. But you don't see that the Talmidei Baal Shem Tov afterwards went all to start davening with kukuriku. They wanted to have the path and the simplicity, the pshitas of that child, but together with all the sophistication and all the state of the shtalshus, because then you have etzem b'pnimius, etzem b'goli, and therefore you have the entire structure, not just etzem to etzem, but etzem that also wanted giluyim, which is also part of the atzmis dika plan. So in a strange way, giluyim ultimately are also part of etzem, because that's what etzem wanted. However, we don't understand that until we climb the ladder and go through all these levels. Okay, so I will exhale now, and I'm sure you guys want to say something or ask something, and if not...
Usually I thought that it without a vowel, but here I see that he repeats it a few times,
Yeah, but then he goes back but he still calls it tachlis hayediyah. And he calls it hakorev hargosha ba'atzmus. That's the key line there.
Does naida mean that it's not knowable?
I thought I explained. There's two. Das has two meanings. Das can be in seichel, and das could be in hergish.
No, I'm just saying the word naida.
It depends on what context.
Mm-hmm. Noida is no.
If you're talking about which level, das tachten, das Elyon, or the highest das Elyon, which one are you talking? You're talking about tachas haydir shaloi neda?
Inyan das Elyon hu kamaymer tachlis hayadir shaloi neda.
Right.
So.
Okay, so he explains what he means. Read on.
So that means that it's not knowable.
Well,
yes.
Why don't you translate what knowable means? Knowable in seichel, it's not knowable, but he says the hakir hagis es enso shalei neder b'chinas hasoga klal.
You can never understand it.
In the terms of seichel, yes. Yeah. But you can have das in it nevertheless. He says afterwards, there's a das hakara that comes after hasoga, but that's not what we're talking about. Then he says, "Humasha etzem hanefesh." Read this line: "Masha etzem hanefesh makir umargish atzmus ein seif." So he's using the same words, makir umargish, which was hakara and hargosha that he used by das. But now it's not because you understand that you've look. I gave the example yesterday, and I'll say it again. If you're looking at a painting, mashal from the Frierdiker Rebbe, or you immerse yourself in a subject, and you become completely absorbed, right? To the point that it's das, hakara and hargosha, hiskashus. You're not just connecting to it in the abstract. You personalize it. You identify with it. It's you, right? Clear?
Yeah.
That's in seichel. That means you've bound yourself. You bound yourself to the idea. That is the lower levels. Then the form of hiskashus. It's due to the fact that a father and a son, or father and a child, a parent and a child, are be'etzem connected. It's not because you are connecting yourself to it through hamokah, through depth, through immersing yourself or appreciating it. It's just the way it is. Etzem is part of an etzem. And you come to recognize that, that's also das. But that's a das shalei neda of das sel seichel. So tachlis hayediyah. The ultimate yediyah is the yediyah that's not a seichel diki yediyah. It's an atzmis diki yediyah, if you want to put it in different terms. That's how I would explain this.
Reminds me of a story, the chassid that slept on a bench for 30 years. And he said that That one.
He said that if I lost one day putting on tefillin because I slept on a bench, it wasn't worth it, right?
And then somebody said about
That
that.
it takes 30 years, right? It takes 30 years to sleep on a bench to come to such hakara, right?
The Tzemach Tzedek said that.
Yeah. Yeah. That is actually right, correct. That's exactly right. So in other words, if you find that a 5-year-old, Ben Chamish Lemikra, says, they ask him, what's pshat in what you're learning? He says, I don't know. Or a 3-year-old. And you go to a zokin, a Meredika Gon zokin, who's 90 years old, and learned Kol HaTeira Kula, and you ask him, so what do you come to? And he says, I don't know. Is the I don't know of the child the same as the I don't know of the scholar? Obviously not. Because his I don't know precedes knowledge. And the other ones I don't know follows knowledge. That the idea brought him. Look, Tachas idea Shalei Neda can be interpreted several ways. You could, on the most basic, you could say the more you know, the more you realize how much you don't know. You could say that. You could also say deeper. Tachas, the ultimate knowledge is knowing that you don't know. Knowing that's so much beyond you. And then you could say Tachas idea Shalei Neda, that the ultimate idea is not a neda al pitam v'das al pisechel. In other words, you come to know the unknowable. You feel the unknowable. You can feel the knowable, hakod argosha, in that which is known, or you can come to hakod and argosha, to that which is beyond seichel dika knowledge, atzmis dika. That, to me, it sounds like that because he uses the word makiru margish. That's the key line. Etzem hanefesh makiru margish. If he didn't use makiru margish atzmus ein sof, you could say tachlis hayidiyah. The idea in Das Tachna and Das Elyon in the lower level leads you to a place that's beyond Das. But the fact that he uses it sounds to me that the lower Das leads you to a higher Das. And remember, he's calling this Das Elyon Amiti. That's another key point. He calls this Das Elyon Amiti. He doesn't call it Amitis HaKorah or Amitis HaMetzias. He says it's Das Elyon Amiti, means it's Das, but it's not a Das defined by the logical or supralogical process. Yeah.
You can't say like, I think it like explains in Tanya, it speaks about how there's the emunah that you have after you understand everything, and then there's stuff that you can't understand. You have that emunah, but someone that has that same emunah without understanding anything, it's blind faith. But someone that goes through and understands everything and knows everything, it's it's a different level of emunah.
Yeah, but here he's talking about das, not emunah, right? Yeah. I got it.
And das here means connection. So you have that connection. A parent and a father has that connection. It's the same connection as a little baby, and as the biggest, wisest person. But the wisest person, he understands that this connection runs deeper than anything, because he went through all the Das Tachton and Das Elyon, and then.
Okay, that's fine. Anybody else? Or we should continue on the bottom of the page.
I'm thinking. I think this teaching we just learned answers a question I've always had about. I don't know where the story came from, but what's the difference between a chassid and somebody who never learned Chassidus? When the Gula comes, he'll also know God, but they'll say but the chassid will experience the aha, that he'll recognize.
Yeah.
That's a story of the Tzemach Tzedek. That's where this is from. So,
not about the chassid, non-chassid. He says why he talks about Mashiach, even though we don't know what it is. So he said that the story of someone listening to a conversation behind a wall. Yeah. Maybe it's a different point, but it's similar.
But I always say, so I always felt, hey, what's the big deal? So I won't have that aha, it's not such a big deal. So, why is that so important that I spent 40 years learning Chassidus or whatever, 60, 100 years, 120, so I just to experience an aha. But I think from this teaching, and I was wondering why we were learning this, that there was two words here. There was hakara and hergish. And the hakara, the recognition, is you recognize something that you learned about previously. But now you say, but now I know it. Now I understand it. Now I see it. I now experience it. But that recognition which is different than feeling it, that's an additional quality that was attained after you've gone through this avodas of birurim or avoda of going up those two levels, the lower levels of das. When you go through, and then finally you come to this level, you don't only have hergish, you have hakara, and that hakara to me is so that's it's not just aha that last one moment, oh, now this is what I learned for all those years and now I experience it, but that I think that hakara will permeate the hergish so that it will be a totally different kind of hergish with the hakara, which makes it a very fundamental and important internal kind of advantage, so to speak, or a benefit of all this learning it before going up that ladder than just hakara.
Okay. I will add something just to maybe give a good example for this. I remember when I was, you probably all remember when you were children, right? And then we grow into teenagers, and then we go into adults, and now we are wherever we are. Could you implant, is it possible for you to share, let's say 50, 60, 70 years of your experience in life with a teenager, that they should know it exactly as you know it? Idea. I'm not talking about facts and data. I remember an experiment I once tried. I tried to speak to one of my younger siblings and tried to explain what I learned through my maturity, and thought maybe we can bridge these two worlds. Can you bring the enthusiasm and the energy of a young person with the experience of an older person? Can they ever come together? So as smart as a person may be, when you're 9 years old, there's no way you will ever be able to experience what a 15-year-old experiences. Then when you get to 15, 16, and you think you know it all, and then you turn 20, 21, 22, you realize, oh boy, oh man, did I not know it? And then you think, okay, now I've arrived. I speak to 23, 24-year-olds. Okay, now they've arrived. I said, as much as you don't know, as much as you would tell a 15-year-old they can't have a clue what you know now as a 24-year-old, trust me, when you turn 40, it's going to be exactly the same thing, just in a different way. Yes, you're more mature than you were. 25 is closer perhaps to 40 than 25 to 9. But there's things that you cannot really convey. Let's talk about marriage. You talk to a newlywed or a bacher or a girl dating, as smart as they are and as mature as they are and as savvy as they may be, they will never understand certain things. Like the mystery that every husband will tell you, the older I get, the less I understand my wife. Yes, I know her better, but there's certain mysteries that you just discover as you go along and you come to peace with it. And it's a real idea. We're not talking about Amunah or some just accepting on blind faith because the Rebbe said so. Life experience, which you can't even articulate. Someone will say, so tell me, what do you know as a 60, 70-year-old that I don't know as a 30-year-old? And I'm not talking about information again. Not that you came and discovered a good investment or a trick of how to turn on light bulbs or whatever it is. I'm talking about life knowledge. It's impossible to convey. So he say, Koy inish adaita de Rabbi. It's interesting, adaita de Rabbi. Daas. Doesn't say bina and chachma of the Rabbi. Adaita de Rabbi, ada boyin shnin. Why can't I get it at 30 years, 20 years, 5 years? I'm a smart guy. There's something that you cannot get unless you go through certain things. And honestly, it needs to be really articulated what those things are. But it's the end of the day, like I told the bacher, he was telling me he knows everything. Whatever. I said, you ever heard the expression, Ein chacham kabal nesayin? The wise person is not, there's no chacham like the one that experienced it. So he says, I know that Maimer Chazal. So now he thinks since he knows the Maimer Chazal, he has the experience. I said, you know it, but you don't have the experience. But this is why I'm saying it to all of you, because I really believe it's a certain type of experiential knowledge. Maybe that's a good word to use even. a knowledge that comes through going through something, which is not purely acquiring information. It's acquiring a certain bonding, even a relationship. We're talking about hakara, hargosha, with that. Now, obviously, as I said, a newborn has a atzmizdik sense of his or her mother or father. Smell, not always a smell, they just whatever. But that is not the same as what I'm talking about, because what I'm talking about is the experience of it. So let's go to Mashiach and Gula. It's not just the aha, Elias. Aha is a nice word, but aha is more than aha. It means it's you. You really appreciate and experience Atzmus. Not just you're near Atzmus and you're part of the show, you're part of the party, and you're not excluded. You really have really connected with him in a way that others have not. And that is more than just, so it's not purely information. It's just you when you bathe in Chassidus and learn Chassidus now, I'm talking about before the Geula, in the fullest sense of the word, you're not just learning ideas, you are actually becoming a more godly person. You think more godly, you feel more godly, your behavior is more godly. I'm not saying we're perfect, but you have become, you understand what you've swum the waters of godliness. It's not like, so then when it comes, you are already in that water. Of course, it's a whole different level and dimension, but it's an experience. Like you're going to say Talmudei biyadei, that when he comes up Lamaila, he can't go into Gan Eden because he didn't learn. Even the biggest Ish Pashat, or even Baal Tshuva, like the question that Rizal asked, Rabbi Elazar ben Derdaya, his whole life he lived a very sinful life. Then the last minute of his life, he bent down and Bocha, he cried, and Kana Ilame B'Shah Achas. He earned his right to Elam Haba in 1 minute. In one Shah means one kev, one turn, 1 hour. So the question that Rizal asked, fine. He acquired it qualitatively, he's ready to go in. But he doesn't have the levushim. How is he going to learn a Gemara Masechta Eidavin? He never learned Eidavin. He doesn't know Ivra. He doesn't know, I don't know with Rabbi Elazar ben Dai whether he knew Ivra or not, but I mean to say he doesn't have the tools. So fine, he's earned his way. He got an express ticket and got himself right into the highest levels of Elam Haba. But he doesn't know how to read. He doesn't know how to learn. How exactly is he going to internalize it? So the Rizal answers, interestingly, that Rabbi Yechon Kohen Gadol, who nasid zduki lepei shana l'shmeinim shana, who became a zduki at 80 years old, which is another discussion what happened there. So those 80 years of his levushim were transferred to Rabbi Elazar ben Derdaya, who I believe was also 80. So in other words,
he was a Gilgul of him.
Huh?
Rabbi Elazar ben Derdaya was a Gilgul of Yechanan Kohen Gadol.
Okay, but so that's the answer. In other words, it's one thing getting in. Let's say you were able to zeiche, someone lets you into the inner chamber with all the rabbeim, and you can sit in Kodesh Kadoshim, but you don't understand a word they're saying. You don't know what's going on. So you got your way in. So it's like the mafteches chitzenius are there. Means you got your way into the first door, but you don't know what they're talking about, and you can't appreciate it. So that's the second half of internalizing. Dira b'tachtenim. Anyway, I just thought this maturity thing may be helpful in the context of things.
Very good, very interesting. What about, I want to die, Ani rote palel al das atinok. Same kind of thing. I always said,
Exactly
we're learning all the,
thing.
right? You're learning all the kavanas of the Rizal, or if not a Rizal, at least the kavanas of derech tefillah, darkei tefillah and Chassidus and everything. And then they say you're still only dealing with gilulim. You want to talk David like a child says tata. I said, so what's the goodness?
Okay, so the Tzemach Tzedek, we talked about it when we learned Basa Legani chapter 11 and Tavshin Chaf Aleph. So in Derech Mitzvah Sechad, go to Sherish Mitzvah Tefillah, chapter 8, he discusses exactly that. So if it's Spal Daza Atinik, so why do we need all the spheres and all the kavanas? Because at the end of the day, you need both. To really have the full integration, you need both in the complete sense of the word. It's like you need a mitzvah, but you also need Torah, the gilui of it. Remember I mentioned to you, Vayakel, Sicha Vayakel, Chelik Tez Zayin. Tezayin, yeah. talks a lot about this in the context of Torah mitzvahs, Eir and Keli, yeah. Eir and Yesh. Okay, let's learn a few lines at least. So with the 3 lines from the bottom of page 1180, so now the Rebbe Rashab is going to tie it together, not just what we learned about Daas Elyon and Daas Tachten, but also, if you remember, let me refer you to the pages. Okay, so on page 1168 and 1169, he explained, if you remember, after earlier, explained that where's the Ayin? The Ayin, Yesh Amiti, Yesh, I'm sorry, the Ayin Amiti and Ayin of the Yesh Anivra, Daas Elyon, Daas Tachten. He first spoke about it, how it's all in Atzilus. Atzilus is Daas Elyon. Then he spoke how Atzilus has Daas Elyon and Daas Tachten. Chachmilah, Chachmetata, Malchus. And then he went and said all of Atzilus is Daas Tachten and Keser is Daas Elyon. And in Keser, the Daas Elyon also has 2 levels. Arich and Atik. And then in Atik, Primius Atik, and then in Radlah, the highest level of all. This is all on page, what I just said now is the pages, Atzilus is all about, yeah, 1162 and on is about Atzilus. 1161 and on is about Atzilus. And what I just spoke about is page 1166 and 1167. I'm sorry, 1168 and 1169. So now he's going to tie it all together. Now that we said Lechem in Haaretz is Daas Tachten. The Shiluv Havaya Ba'adnai. And Lechem in Hashemayim is Daas Elyon. The Shiluv Adnai Ba'avaya. The Bitl of Kalim. He says, V'zehu, this lower level is B'chinas Chitzenius HaKeser. V'chitzenius Atik. U'b'shoshe B'chinas Chitzenius the Eir Ein Sof. So remember, he spoke about all these levels, relatively speaking. So the outer dimension of all of them is the way the divine relates to existence. So he says, V'zehu, V'zehu, to me, seems to be referring back to Daas Tachten. Yichud Havaya Likim B'chinas Shiluv Havaya Ba'adnai. Not the Yichud, not the Shiluv Havaya, even though V'amshocha V'agila Zeh B'chinas Sheresh Shemokar Eir. Anyway, so there's the outer dimension of everything, the outer dimension of Keser, the outer dimension of Atik, and its root is the outer dimension of Ein Sof. If you remember, like the Machshava V'ano Emlech, that already relates, like Hadras Melech, relates to another. And now he adds, V'hu B'chinas Einiga Atzmi Hababa Murgish. No, I want to correct myself. No, mistaken. He's not talking about Daas Tachten, the lowest one of the 3 levels. He's talking about now, Lechem in Hashemayim, he said, is Kalim of Atzilus, right? And it brings to the Sheresh Shemokar Eir. But he wants to introduce the 3rd level, the true Daas Elyon. So this is a little confusing because first you start Daas Tachten, then you go to Daas Elyon, then there's a Daas Elyon that's higher than the Amiti's Daas Elyon, the true Daas Elyon. So what he's saying, V'zeu b'chinas chitzenius hakeser, I see it from Einig HaMurgish, I realize, Einig HaAtzmi, he's talking about the 2nd level. He's talking about Daas Elyon, but in the world of Atzilus, recognizing the Kalim, recognizing Sheresh Shemokar Eir, that's higher than the Eir in the Kalim. That is what he's calling Chitzenius Eir now. And Chitzenius Atik, and the root Chitzenius Ein Sof. And that's Einig Atzmi Hababa Murgish. Remember, I referred you in the beginning of this class. We specifically said that was the 2nd level. On page 1129, 2nd level, Einig Atzmi, but it's Murgish. Okay. But now comes the 3rd level, the highest level. V'amitis hayediyah the Daas Elyon, and the true, again, the 3rd time he's saying this. the true yediyah, awareness of the higher das, the higher awareness, hu b'chinas pnimius hakav, v'hu b'chinas lechem min hashamayim. Let's stop a moment. That's pnimius hakav, not chitzenius ha'er, but pnimius hakav. If you remember, in the page 1169, he started talking about chitzenius hakav and pnimius hakav. And the pnimius hakav is rooted in Teferes Hanelam all the way to Atzmus Ein Sof. So now he's talking the highest third level. Pnimius hakav, and page 1181. V'hu b'chinas lechem min hashamayim, the man, shu b'chinas pnimius haTeira. So this is in the man itself. We had learned two levels. The first level we learned is the lower level of Das Elyon, now the higher level. And this is Pnimius HaTeira, the inner dimension of Teira, Shu Gili B'chinas Atzmus Ein Sof Baruch Hu. That's the revelation of Atzmus Ein Sof Baruch Hu. Ubederech Klal, and in general, Lechem min Hashamayim Nitten B'matan Teira. Lechem min Hashamayim was given by Matan Teira. What does that mean? L'cheira, we know that the man started falling at the end of what end of the month of it was right before Matan Teira, right? Yeah. That's why it says Lo nitna Teira ela la'echle haman. So Matan Teira needed to have man already. Lechem min haaretz was not enough because Teira is connected to man. That's what he means. Lechem min hashamayim is primus is lechem min hashamayim with nitn man Teira. The gam chitzenius Teira. Also, the outer dimension of Teira, hu b'chinas Das Elyon. It's also Das Elyon, but it's hu b'chinas Das Elyon datzilus, meaning the lower level of Das Elyon that we're learning here. Va'ikir hu pnimius Teira, and the primary dimension of man, of real Das Elyon, is pnimius Teira. Shezeu agili b'chinas pnimius v'atzmus Ein Sof. That's the revelation of the inner and core of Ein Sof. And this is the meaning why right after Yetzias Mitzrayim, when they left Egypt, they didn't have yet man. That came later. They first had lechem min haaretz, because you want to have the separation and the clarity from the bottom up. You have to first start. Remember, we learned that when they were still in Mitzrayim, they had no das and hargosh and alakus. So you first have to, it's like a child. You first have to start feeding them in a way they can eat before you feed them solids, so to speak. So first they have the birum matlamai lechem min haaretz, or b'matan teira nitn lem hayediyah de lechem min hashamayim. So even though the man fell before Matan Teira, but Matan Teira really consummated and solidified their relationship with a higher level of Das. And that's the Yichud of Havai Lekim Das Elyon, and in Das Elyon itself, we have learned now two levels. So this concludes this Maimer 141 without the ending. I just wanted to read something so we have some. So I'm going to stop here, top of 1181. Anybody want to ask anything?
So the man did not help them to reach it until Matan Teira, right?
It was like Hagdama to Matan Teira.
But
It's like Hagdama to Matan Teira. They were like being prepared. First they have man. It acclimates them to be able to be Kalim for Hamshacha Primis. He says, he means the Hamshacha of it, but there's nothing worse like Misha Torah B'Erev Shabbos, Yechel B'Shabbos. It's like a preparation for it.
because how does that stem with what you were saying yesterday? I think it was yesterday, where you said that Avodas Birurim, Spheres HaOmer, was 49 days, where we're doing the lower Das Tachton, which is not the. You would think that you would. The last few days, you're saying that there was God sort of like gave us a preparation, like Erev Shabbos.
I think it's like an overlap. It's like when you start weaning a child off liquids to solids. You don't just do it in one shot.
Uh-huh.
So it's like a transition.
Transition.
They begin with lechem min haaretz and the Spheres HaOmer, and that leads them as they get closer to Matan Torah. When was the Yeridas Haman? That was on what date was it?
Come on, Rabbi Tatel, you know these
Iyar.
things.
In the
What's
month of
date?
Iyar.
I think it was Tesvav Iyar.
Right.
I'm not sure.
So basically, around 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks before Matan Torah.
Uh-huh.
So I have to look. I think in my Morim it may speak about it because he began. It makes sense. You're starting to prepare them to go from Das Tach to Das Ad. Remember, this isn't black and white. This is Aveda. So it's transitions.
It's like the difference between Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. Pesach Rishon is Avodas Habirurim, and then the dialogue of Pesach Sheni is in Kedusha itself. And when does the month start? Starts right after Pesach Sheni.
I would think it's more like Erev Shabbos, the preparation for Shabbos after Chatzot. That from Mincha Gadola on, you know, you Alpi Halacha, you're supposed to. There's different halachas involved. Whether it's Mincha Gadola or there's even a thing in brought down Shulchan Aruch, right? That this is a preparation for Shabbos. Our avodas, like what we're in now after Tafshin Nun, 5750. You know, we have a different avoda, but it doesn't start. It can start from different periods after Chosel, right before actually, you know, Knasa Shabbos, before Shkia, that there's a preparation for it that changes. And that could be that, something like that.
Okay. So we'll stop here.